Welcome back to Shore Sports Talk on 94.3 The Point, sponsored by Shoreline Wealth Management. I am Vin Ebenau, and I am joined this morning by Kirk McKnight, author of The Voices of Baseball, now out there on Amazon and wherever you find books, all about the stories that baseball play-by-play broadcasters, past and present, are telling about the ballparks they're in and the teams that they're covering. It is a very insightful and amazing book. And Kirk, before we dive into some of what you covered here in the book, just want to welcome you onto the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, I think one of those things, and you hinted at it in the book as well with Vin Scully, is that he just was so widely respected and loved everywhere, from every fan base, every broadcaster, and he's just, I think it's agreed that he's just the best baseball play-by-play broadcaster there ever was, and it's kind of like, okay, how can we learn from Vin Scully to be better play-by-play broadcasters and everything? And I thought you highlighted that really well in this book with the narratives from some of the other broadcasters, but also your own personal story with Vin Scully as well. So what was that like, your interaction with Vin Scully and talking to him?
Well, that was, I feel like up to that point, I feel like I'd had enough. Not enough. You can never have enough pinch me moments, but I feel like I'd had plenty. And but that really was a pinch me moment that made you kind of think, no, this one is. Talking with John Sterling, in the visiting booth at the Angel Stadium of Anaheim before watching the Yankees beat the Angels. Okay, that was amazing. Talking with John Miller in person and in a Sheridan or wherever in Scottsdale, Arizona, and typing in his name, into my audio recording software, and saying I'm really talking with John Miller. That's surreal, but those still get trumped by speaking with Vin Scully and having him call you and, introducing himself to me, saying, "Hi, I'm Vin Scully. I broadcast Los Angeles Dodgers baseball." Like he's talking to a guy who's doing a book on baseball broadcasting, and he still feels he has to tell me what he does for a living. and so that right there started the whole, the 30-minute conversation that we had. And I just thought, wow. I'm talking with a living legend, and I have talked with living legends before, but I'm talking with a living legend who probably is the pinnacle of broadcasting in any sport. And now he is willing to share his memories for this book that I'm doing. And it just really catapulted my spirits about it all. And I just thought, wow, this really is going to be the peak of it all, and I've had interviews since. I've talked with Bob Costas, and I've talked with Bob Uecker, and even Tom Hamilton discussing the Cleveland Indians /Guardians. I mean, these are all awesome moments in my interviewing, experience. But I mean, they all come in second, obviously, to talking with Van.
You're definitely somebody I always love listening to, love looking up to and everything, and certainly it helps with MLB Network once that came into existence with allowing everybody to watch more Vin Scully broadcast on that level and everything, and just hearing how smooth he is and calling a game, his descriptions of everything going on, his storytelling abilities. And just, describing, the Dodger Stadium in Chavez Ravine. What were some of the things that you learned about Vin Scully and his style of broadcasting from his days in Brooklyn out to Los Angeles, and just what he did over the course of a broadcast?
Well, see, I consider myself comparatively young when I'm talking with broadcasters. Most of them are all older than I am. Obviously, I'm 44 years old, and so to me, don't realize that somebody like Vin Scully himself had a tutor, and so learning, speaking with Vin and realizing that, him admitting that he basically learned the ropes from Red Barber, and you're thinking, wow, so you mean somebody taught you, you're Scully, but like you yourself were a student, and And then obviously people of a generation older than me would remember when Red Barber used to call games for the Dodgers and the Yankees, and basically think, okay, we're Vin got these things, and Vin made them. Vin made things his own though too, and that's obviously he would make things his own. But just kind of having that thought and having that wow. So you yourself were like the Sorcerer's Apprentice kind of thing. You were Mickey Mouse, the broom's getting out of hand with the spell going wrong or something possibly, that you were still like learning and taking notes from somebody like Red Barber, which is, I mean, if you think about it, Red Barber, it's only fitting that he learned from somebody like Red Barber, because Red Barber himself is probably thought of as one of the greatest broadcasters of taking somebody by the hand who's listening in on the game and taking them through the broadcast. So those things just make sense. It's just I'm from a younger, I'm from a younger generation, and so these things basically become knowledge to me as they come along. They weren't already like in my memory bank because I didn't live through them.
And I want to stick with the Dodgers here and talk about Charlie Steiner. I remember vaguely when he was on SportsCenter, but I mean, as growing up as a Yankee fan, I remember him in the booth with John Sterling in 2003 and 4. And of course, he's got one of the most iconic broadcast calls in the history of baseball with Aaron Boone's Game 7 walk-off against the Red Sox in 03. That'll live on forever. But I mean, in reading your book, just Charlie Steiner, a lifelong Dodgers fan, and the way he described getting used to, broadcasting remotely during the COVID pandemic a couple of years ago, and getting to call the Dodgers winning a World Series, it was like this out-of-body experience for him. So what was it like in covering Charlie Steiner and sharing his broadcast experience?
Well, I feel like Charlie Steiner might have been one of the top interviews I've done. I've done a couple interviews with him, but they're always entertaining. And I say they're one of the top because he's so entertaining to listen to. He's so entertaining to hear a story from. And I mean, I have met him in person and seen him a couple of different times in the booth or at spring training or, on the road in a Padres game or something like that. And knowing, in 2014, the first time I interviewed him, and seeing, his journey to becoming where he was at 2014 and being in the booth with Scully and being the person who caught the broadcasting bug at a very young age by listening to Scully in his basement, and then you see that in 2020 he actually had this experience of, 65 years later, basically, from when the Dodgers beat the Yankees on Johnny Padres shutout, and that's the game that kind of hooked him as far as like, this is amazing and this is baseball. And now he's calling the Dodgers winning the World Series. And he's calling it from his living room where he was as a little 6 or 7-year-old pretending to call games in his basement. And so it was like a full circle thing. And if you think of the number 65, it's such a fitting number because it's like the token age of retirement. Like this is 65 years, this is your career, this is your life, and now your life you can go off into the sunset now. And like honestly, you think about that, you're like, so Charlie just drove, he made that call from his living room and he took his headset off and that's when he retired, right? Well, no, but it could have been. And so for him to have that full circle experience like that and share it with you, especially knowing his personality, it's such a great part of the book. And I was grateful for that. I was actually grateful for the Dodgers winning the World Series because it gave Charlie that experience. That was the only reason I was pulling for the Dodgers in 2020. Otherwise, I'm all about the Rays because I'm all about somebody. When you think about that World Series, and you think about in terms of payroll, it would have been a great story if the Rays would have actually won that 2020 World Series. But the fact that the Dodgers won, I could take some solace in knowing that Charlie got his moment. Vin had been retired for about 4 years, and now here's Charlie on the call, and he basically had a pathway to that moment set up basically for him. We're going through these problems where people are having to broadcast from a remote studio or something, and Charlie's just sitting there shaking his head in a Zoom meeting with the Dodgers organization, like, what are we doing here? Like, and, getting the phone call later after the Zoom meeting saying, you seemed upset. And he's just thinking, is this what's going to do me in? Is COVID going to cut me off at the knees? Is this the end of my career? And the fact that they were able to play around it and have him broadcast from his living room, I mean, you don't do that for your everyday broadcaster. If you're basically a general manager or the media relations manager for a team, you don't do that for just anybody. But they did it for Charlie, and I'm glad they did. And Charlie was very deserving of being able to have that moment to call that World Series win.
Talking with Kirk McKnight this morning, author of the book, The Voices of Baseball. Kirk went ahead East Coast here, starting with the Yankees and the Mets. Certainly with the Yankees, I know you said you had an encounter with John Sterling in the past out in Anaheim before the Yankees played the Angels and everything. But John's been doing Yankee games since 1989. I know he was with the Atlanta Braves before that. Michael Kay went into the radio booth in the mid-'90s as well, and then he went over to the YES Network in 2002. But they've just been there. They've been a staple of Yankees broadcasting now for at least 30 years. And Sterling's had a career before that. But there's just like this sense of tradition and pride with the Yankees and Yankee Stadium. And, and I know you touched on the ballpark and everything too, but they just feel like they wanted to get it right. The seats are a little bit bigger, more cushions, but there's more suites. I think Sterling described it as like a bunch of condos. So in covering the Yankee Stadium part, I guess the old stadium, new stadium, and in talking to John Sterling and Michael Kay, I mean, what were your biggest takeaways from them?
Well, I actually am a Yankees fan myself. Since this book has come out, I've become a more all-encompassing fan of all the teams, but all the teams except for a couple. I don't even name those two. But, I've been more of a fan of the Yankees throughout the way because Cecil Fielder was my favorite player. And when he went to the Yankees in July of 96, I went to the Yankees in July of 96, basically. I was a diehard Tigers fan, but I was a diehard Cecil Fielder fan above all. And so, I was able, and people call me a bandwagoner, but they don't understand the story. I was a Cecil Fielder guy. And so, and I was there as a fan to experience, 5 World Series titles over the next, 15 years or so. And John Sterling, about John Sterling is that you mentioned he was broadcast with the Braves. Well, he broadcast with the Braves during the 80s. And my favorite player was Del Murphy. And so, when I'm basically, I always felt like there was some kind of familiarity. But I was a really young kid when Sterling and Murphy were there with the Braves. And so I knew there was always some kind of familiarity with John Sterling. Getting ready for the interview with him the morning in the hotel, and then, knowing I'm going to be speaking with him in the booth, I sat there and thought, I'm reading up on his name. I'm like, that's right. He was with the Braves. To think about going from the mediocre 80s Braves to the mediocre late 80s Yankees, having to kind of still go through the trenches a little bit for a few years, and then all of a sudden being able to call 4 World Series championships in 5 years, and then call another one about 9 years after that. And you think about Sterling in the booth with him, and I see his World Series ring, and it looks like a ring pop ring. It is just so massive. It looks like a ring pop ring that's full of diamonds, like some little kid comes and finds it in his dad's dining and is like, "Can I eat this?" And the cat's like, "Absolutely not, you can't. That's about $4 million, And so that, to me, is a perfect illustration of Yankees baseball and the Yankees. Just like John said, he said, the Yankee Stadium is like a 5-star. Actually, Howie Rose was the one that said this. He said Howie Rose said that for the Mets, said that the new Yankee Stadium is like a 5-star hotel.
Oh yeah, that
built around a ballpark. And that's so when you see John Sterling sitting there holding that ring like that, wearing that ring like that, it's not like he's sitting there flashing around like he's, notorious B.I.G. like going into a club. It's just that's that's the way the Yankees do. And so seeing that, and then seeing that as a perfect illustration of the way the Yankees go. They go big, and they do it big because they're the Yankees. I mean, outside of the Dallas Cowboys and like one's professional soccer team somewhere that just makes ridiculous amounts of revenue, I think the Yankees are basically up there in the top three of all sporting events. But I'm pretty sure as far as revenue and value of the team, that's where they are. They're the top of it. And so John has had a very blessed, tenure there with the Yankees, starting out with those few years where they were still bad, but then they started to get good. And then they even got better. And so it's like Michael Kay did say, he said, I've just been blessed to be around this. He feels very blessed himself to have been around calling players like Jeter. I mean, I can't think of another player who has accomplished more in the last 30 years than Jeter. As far as, Pujols comes in there probably around there. As far as just, if you think of accomplishments, you think of championships, Jeter has the 5, Pujols has the 2. And you think of offensive statistics, Jeter also was a great defensive shortstop. So, I mean, if you think of like that you basically were able to call the entire career of somebody like Derek Jeter, you have a very blessed life. And now we have players like Judge that are there, and there's other, and then Mariano Rivera. Let's not forget about Mariano Rivera.
Yeah.
I mean, Mariano Rivera and Derek Jeter are two figures that you just consider yourself among the most blessed to have if you have one of them and able to call their entire career. And these guys were able to call both of these guys' entire careers.
Going over to Queens, and you touched on Howie Rose, Kirk. He another kind of like Michael Kay and even Charlie Steiner, just with lifelong fans of their teams. Howie Rose, big-time Mets fan, but he's had a phenomenal career. He's got that. I've always sensed that pride for the Mets history and tradition and everything. And even when they were going over from Shea Stadium to now Citi Field and the way they were designing that ballpark, he just told such a great story about how the tradition of the Mets has carried over from their World Championship teams in Shea Stadium, the Amazons, and then certainly now in Citi Field and trying to get a title or two over there. Came close a few years back, but in covering Howie Rose for this book, what were some of the biggest things you learned about Howie Rose and the Mets?
Well, Howie basically, it's like you mentioned, it's great that Howie was able to be the fan of the team growing up and basically is the voice of them, and is one of the voices that people point to, especially on the radio. But, he considers that 1969 team, the Amazons, like one of the greatest New York, if not the greatest New York sports story ever told. And I know that, like, I'm here on the west side, but I know that a lot of people on the East Coast will probably agree with that sentiment, even though, that's one championship, and you got the Yankees on the other side with, however, they're 27, you got the Mets with the 69 and the 86, and those are 2 titles, but that 69 championship is, like, so cherished in the hearts of people who were there around when it happened, and he was one of those. And so it's kind of like it's a springboard to basically get you off and running. And he has been off and running, and he has had some awesome moments to call. And one of the main reasons, I'd already actually spoken with Wayne Hagan for a lot of the Citi Field stuff for the book, and Wayne was great. Wayne was there just a short bit, and he gave me plenty of perspective on City and a couple of things on Shea. But he wasn't calling the game when Johan Santana pitched that no-hitter. And Howie put such a great perspective on that Johan Santana no-hitter, because you think about it, I mean, what was he, in the 140 range pitch-wise? And just, like, nowadays you do not do that to a pitcher. Now, you read old books, these pitchers do like 200 pitches sometimes in these 16-inning games or whatever back in the, not necessarily modern-era baseball, but that game really, it cemented him in Mets history as far as Johan Santana. But, I mean, it really kind of set the tone for the rest of his career, which really kind of took a turn for the worse because of those kinds of things and pitching 140, throwing 144 pitches. And he never was the same player since, but he said, he himself said, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I would still do what I did. And let's see, Terry was the manager, wasn't he, for the Mets when
Oh, yeah, Terry Collins, yeah.
Yeah, so Terry Collins, you're thinking from a manager perspective, most managers would have taken him out, regarding
Oh, yeah, especially in today's game.
Yeah, in today's game. And Terry knew that, there's no way that he could live it down if he did.
Yeah.
It was a tough spot for him. History was made, first no-hitter, and what's even funnier is fast forward a few years later, and I was talking to Howie about this since the original edition of the book came out. I was talking to him about the combined no-hitter. And he's like, that was cute. It obviously doesn't have the same sentiment,
right?
As the first, but also just one person doing it and doing it in the manner that Johan did. So I was really grateful to be able to put that in the Citi Field chapter. It's really it's really a strong part of the book if you think about it, because it's such a huge thing. Same thing with the Musgrove no-hitter from 2021. It was the first no-hitter for the Padres.
Oh, yeah?
There's a backstory for that one, too.
And so many broadcasters, I mean, you think about it, so rarely is there a chance to call a no-hitter or a perfect game, and then you want to get it just right. And these broadcasters, you put a little pressure on yourself because you want to call it like a game, but also understand that a little bit of history is being made here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the interesting thing about something like the Musgrove no-hitter was we still were not out of the whole COVID restriction things, and I think we still aren't in some part as far as the traveling broadcast teams. So this game, it wasn't even in Petco Park, San Diego. It was in Globe Life Field in Texas, like a brand-new ballpark on its second year. Technically, it's first if you think about it, because it was only occupied for the most part in that first season by cardboard cutout. So, I mean, we're talking about the 2021 season, and you're calling your team's first no-hitter in history from your own ballpark in the visiting TV booth. So, as the radio team, they really were tasked with basically doing what they do every day and painting the picture for their listeners. And that's exactly what they had to do, because they're kind of painting the picture for themselves. They're watching the stuff on a monitor. And so they really, okay, well, we really have to create this visual now, don't we? We're not even taking in the aroma. We're not taking in the fresh air from the ballpark. We're not hearing the sights and sound, or we're not hearing the sound or seeing the sights, and so as the game was going along, they were able to still tell the story of a kid who's, grew up in San Diego and was a fan of the Padres, going to Petco Park as a young fan, and now he's throwing the first no-hitter in team history. And, it's a great story. It's a great story, but it's also a great backstory when you think of the situation where these guys are calling this game that's happening 1,300 miles away. They're looking at it on a monitor. They're taking their fans through historical game, and they have what they have. They have two fold-out tables that they're not even at like an actual broadcast booth desk. I mean, they're like in this makeshift thing. This is like when you were in your parents' basement making, like Wayne's World kind of thing, like, we got what we got, this is what we're doing, and we're calling a game, and we're calling a historical game, and here this is what we've got, and we're doing it, and they did. And, he and Tony Gwynn Jr., and it's Jesse Aguilar, the lead on the call, and Tony Gwynn Jr. helping them, and here they are, doing it just like Wayne and Garth.
I love that analogy. Kirk, you certainly covered all the teams and the different broadcasters and everything from so many different perspectives in describing the ballpark, and having these play-by-play broadcasters describe what has happened with their team, what is going on with their team. Tom McCarthy with the Phillies, Brian Anderson and Bob Uecker among those with the Milwaukee Brewers. Bob Uecker, also known to a lot of other people as Harry Doyle from Major League. And I think he took on a whole nother, or grew his audience from there. John Miller with the Giants and the Orioles. And certainly Sunday Night Baseball for a while with ESPN. Hawk Harrelson with the White Sox. Tom Hamilton, as you mentioned earlier, with Cleveland. And so on and so forth. Chip Carey, Bob Costas. I mean, in talking to all these broadcasters and gathering up all these stories for your book, The Voices on Baseball, I mean, what were some of your biggest takeaways from, talking with and learning, talking with these broadcasters and learning about these teams?
I was talking with Bob Costas the other day just on the phone. That's one of the wonderful things about having Bob Costas in my phone book and contacts is that when he texts me, he says, "Do you have a minute to talk?" Well, yes, of course I do, Mr. Costas. I don't have a minute to talk to Bob Costas. But I told him at the end of our conversation, I said, I feel like I should have a notepad every time I talk to you because you're just so fulgent with knowledge and talking with Bob Costas over the summer and having him, we all know his name. We all know his voice. We all know what he does, and he does it over multiple sports. But you know him in baseball, obviously, and he's definitely got a heart to baseball. And he calls, he's talking about calling the game, and you have to realize as a national broadcaster on a national broadcast, like on NBC Game of the Week or wherever it is he's been calling games, over his career, that you're not necessarily calling for any one team in particular on any one home broadcast, like WFAN or KMOX or, KDK, whatever out there in Pittsburgh. I can't think of a fourth one. I don't want to do that, but, and so you're not necessarily calling, and he made the comparison of like, if you're calling a game in Cincinnati, everybody knows who Joe Burrow is, but if you're calling a game, for a national broadcast, or at least before the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, not that many people know Joe Burrow versus Tom Brady. And so, he was calling, Bob Costas was basically called in for that game that was Jeter's final game at Yankee Stadium, and he was doing the broadcast for it himself. And everybody in the world knows who Derek Jeter is, so it makes it easier for him, but it's not always the case. So you get to know these little tidbits of knowledge from these broadcasters, realizing that they have to approach the game with a different style. I'll give the example of Ryan Lefevre, and I know that this is an East Coast based show, but I think that maybe the fans, although as a sad moment, it's still they can appreciate the broadcasting element of it. So Ryan Lefevre is calling the game for the Royals in 2015. It's in city. It's the Royals were ahead by 5 runs, and there's no way the Mets were going to be winning. But still, the fans were still alive in there at Citi Field, but they were still alive. And then that last out was recorded. That last, I don't know if it was a pop out to center field or whatever it was, but Ryan said that the stadium just went completely quiet. And as a broadcaster, you're trying to encapsulate the moment for those listening on the radio back in Kansas City. And of course, you want to be alight with emotion, and you want to be able to kind of feed off of that crowd energy, which so many broadcasters do. But on the road, it's a different story, especially when a place like New York City goes quiet and dead, where there's 40,000 fans, and you want to basically sit there and shout and show that emotion, which you did. But you also have that other factor coming in against you, where it's kind of like when you're sitting there talking to your neighbor at a show. You're not your neighbor, but like the person sitting next to you at like a show, a concert, and the band's playing, and you're like, "You guys are great, right?" And the guy's like, "What?" And he's like, and then at that moment the band stops, and he goes, "You guys are great, right?" It's like it's like a fish out of water, And that's kind of the moment that Ryan was going through, and he talked to Joe Buck about it. And Joe's a different case because he's on the national broadcast, and they can kind of fill in, and they can add those little touches, those little brush strokes, like Bob Ross did, and add those little brush strokes in on the broadcast to kind of help you out with it. But yeah, you kind of feel like a fish out of water in a situation like that, where you're experiencing your emotion, but everybody around you is just going dead silent.
Kirk, appreciate your time, and this was, again, a fantastic book. The Voices of Baseball, the game's greatest broadcasters, reflect on America's pastime. Loved reading the book, and this is something great that I think everybody should give it a read. Not just for your team out there, but get to know all the broadcasters who have called games for teams across the major leagues over the last several decades. Appreciate your time in coming on and talking about the book.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You can find Kirk's book on Amazon.com. Again, The Voices of Baseball, the game's greatest broadcasters, reflect on America's pastime with Kirk McKnight. More Shore Sports Talk on 94.3 The Point right after this, sponsored by Shoreline Wealth Management.
Whether you're in the early stages of investing, getting ready to retire, or planning your estate, you need a financial planner who will guide you on a clear path with honesty and transparency. Shoreline Wealth Management understands that you are more than your money, and they strive to help you realize your best life as they align your finances with your goals. Best of all, Shoreline's straightforward approach will include you in the process. Shoreline Wealth Management is your financial anchor. Visit shorelinewealth.com for more information. shorelinewealth.com. Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC.